Thank you. So, day 2, okay? This is going to be a little bit of the day where we're going to focus on a lot of details. We're going to get down to the nitty-gritty details of evolution as well as biblical interpretation. Feel free, you guys have, I see your pens and your notes there. Feel free to take notes. There's going to be a lot of information there. So feel free to also write down any questions. I know they're still taking questions in terms of if you want to text it. I received the questions from yesterday. Actually, a lot of them were answered in the open discussion. There's 1 or 2 questions that mainly are about biblical interpretation. I will answer them with the second lecture later today, okay, because they're more towards this. But let's go back to what we talked about yesterday. I think no matter what we come out of this, at least if we can agree that in essentials, we need to be united. I think one of the essentials I would really hope that all of us would come out of this today is that, you know what, God created us and created us for glory. We can debate so much about how and where, how long it's been. Has it been 10,000 years or has it been 10 million years? But I don't think it does change the fact that at the end, we can agree that God created us. Number 2, we can also agree that science is an amazing tool. I see science as a way that I see evidence of God. I don't think it proves to me God's existence or the lack of it, but it gives me a lot of witnessing and a lot of evidence that I see His glory and His beauty there. As I said yesterday about science, and we'll talk a little bit more about it today, I think it's very dangerous when you take science in a way that it proves God, as much as also you can take that science as a way that disproves God. Because I don't think from a scientific perspective that there is any way to do that. But by the same token, I don't want to dissociate science altogether. I think one of the biggest dangers about the interaction of science and the church nowadays in the States is 2 dangers. And I hope that we can be very clear about that. I think the first danger is the danger that says that science is dangerous for faith, so let's avoid science. I think that's extremely wrong. I think the second notion, which I see a lot in our church, when they say, well, you know what, science does not overlap with faith, so there's no conflict. So we try to ease the conflict by saying that there's not overlap, and what's called by actually Stephen Jay Gould, who called it NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria. What does that mean is like, hey, science is here, faith is here, there's no conflict, let's live happily ever after. I think that's very dangerous. You know why? Because in the mind of the people at the university, when you come and tell them, well, science is here and faith is here, they'll tell you, well, you know what? When you come into the university, check out your faith. You're almost living like a bipolar life. I think they overlap, and I think we have to be very careful of how they overlap. I think also it's very dangerous when we make this separation too much as if there is no conflict, because at times, a lot of people in the street are going to say, well, guess what? Science is real, material is real, I can see it. So science is the reality. Faith is fairy tales. And I think that's very dangerous. So be very careful from over-separating science and faith. That's one extreme. And the other extreme, be very, very careful from taking everything that science tells us as a proof of God's existence, because I don't think that's what it's designed to in terms of scientific evidence. Creation versus evolution, are they mutually exclusive? What have we learned so far from yesterday? Number 1, the debate is very complex. Humility. I can tell you, I really honestly say that, and not in a sense that I'm trying to fake it. The more I read on this topic, the more ignorant I feel. The more I read the works of some people who spent their whole life and their whole career reading about it, the more I feel I cannot be that dogmatic. It doesn't mean I don't make my opinion. I have an opinion. But with a lot of ignorance and humility, I realize that I have to always listen to the other and study where they're coming from and study what they have done in research and evaluate it. I think there is a lot of people in this field, including both sides, including Christians and including non-Christians, who just sweepingly make broad judgment without reading enough in the research. The search for truth is complex. It's based on presuppositions that we talked about, fact-finding and beliefs. The history, and this is like, what I talked about yesterday. I was talking this morning with Ramon, and how it's amazing when you look at, actually, you can't just judge how we come to this point without looking into the history of how we came, and how it took 400 years of this tension between faith and faith-based people, the church, as well as science. And it's amazing how, I honestly look at this, when you study history of this, look at the philosophical movements and when did they arise, after what scientific evidence came. And this actually is going to be extremely important for tomorrow's discussion when you find about the bioethical debate, that a lot of this bioethical debate started to rise up extremely much in the debate after contraception was found. It is very interesting. So just like when you look at actually deism, atheism, agnosticism, and you can trace it after 100 years from the foundation or the finding of the mechanical laws of nature, the Newtonian laws, it is very interesting how science affects the philosophy that comes after it. But then it reverses back, that the philosophy then feeds back into the science when it becomes an assumption. Last thing, your presupposition defines much of your conclusion. We talked yesterday about the complexity of truth and how, at the end, this is not just a debate about cells. It's not just a debate about origins. It's not just a debate about science. This is a debate that involves three things that are very, very connected to each other, which makes it very tough to make a decision. It's a debate about God. It's a debate about nature and science. And it's a debate about you and who you are. And you cannot separate it. It's impossible to separate all those three. It makes it intriguing and complex, but challenging. You've got the three biggest domains in the world right now. These are kind of the philosophies. The theism, that looks at nature as a blessing from God. It looks at the philosophy of human existence as the image of God. You look at agnosticism, atheism, that looks at nature as naturalism. It's a scientific philosophy that everything is explained by natural causes. And then philosophy of human existence, human is the peak. Everything revolves about human. And then you've got pantheism, which looks at nature in a dualistic sense, and whether or not the philosophy of human existence, your whole existence is an illusion. It's very interesting, and I love that. And I love that actually, not in a sense that I'm criticizing any other philosophy, but it's really amazing when you look at the development of thought process in humanity, how diverse it is. So now let's get in a little bit into science. What is science? When I look at a definition of science is as follows. It's an observation, it's identification, it's a description, it's experimental investigation, and theoretical explanation of natural phenomena. I think it's a very, very well-rounded definition of most things that would be considered within science. But it's very interesting, and I think this debate will come very much into the debate of evolution. Because in the kind of sciences, you find an experimental science. You have a theory, you have an experiment, you make that experiment. I've got a patient, and you know what, I think this antibiotic is going to work on this patient, and I'm going to do this randomized controlled trial and give 1,000 patients this antibiotic. We'll see if people are going to make it or not. That's an experiment, right? But then you also got observational science, where basically you want to see, okay, how prevalent is a certain disease in a population? You're looking at observational parameters. Versus historical sciences, which kind of goes down into a lot of the forensic sciences. And this has been one of the toughest debates in terms of evolution. You know why? Because look at evolution. Evolution, you are really combining, and by the way, and I have to go back, one of the biggest problems about these three different kinds of sciences is that the techniques are not the same. They overlap. But the techniques of experiment are different than observation. The techniques of observation are different than something that historical that has happened a million years ago. So your techniques are not the same. And sometimes the danger becomes when you take techniques from one kind of science and apply to the other. Why is this pertinent to evolution? What it is? Because you are taking something that is happening right now, us, and you are taking something that is historical in some sense, and you're making the link. And sometimes people would say, well, is this link justifiable or not? Science is very difficult. You know why? Because when you come into the basics of making scientific knowledge, there are actually two things you're looking at very clearly. What is the evidence and what is the experimentation? Can you make an experiment? Sometimes you can use both lines of science in a certain disease state. Like for example, okay, if you have a cancer, okay, and you think that that cancer is related to a certain gene malfunction. Well, you can do observation. You can get all the people with this kind of cancer, okay, and then you can study their gene, and if you find the same gene malfunction, you made an observation. But then you can experiment as well. What if I say, if I genetically can modify and change this gene malfunction, would the cancer risks be different? So in some things, you can use both evidence and experiment to prove a point. But in others, you can't. And at that point, that's going to be the tension in sciences, okay? Which takes the upper hand? Is it evidence? And this evidence could be historical evidence, right? You can't duplicate it. For example, that's the whole thing about the fossil record. The fossil record is historical evidence. You can't duplicate it no matter what we do. But can you experiment in some sense to make sense of what the fossil record looks like? And that's why, for example, like sometimes when they take the genetic information out of the fossil record and they're experimenting, they're doing gene studies between different kind of fossils. But that's when you're taking one way of science, which is evidential, it's an evidence-based, to another one which is experimental, and that tends to be a big problem. Yesterday when I talked about Nicholas Steno, who was the first who actually discovered fossils, one of the foundations of science, which is called uniformitism, okay, that laws are uniform. And I gave the example. If you are on top of the church here and you jump off the church, you're going to fall by gravity. If you do it in a different location, you're going to fall by gravity. If you do it in a different age and era, you're going to fall by gravity. It's uniform. And the problem with science is that, we think of everything as uniform. I'll give you another very simple example. If I have somebody with high blood pressure and I'm going to give them the medication, it's my expectation as uniform outcome that your blood pressure is going to come down in that level with this medication. Does that happen all the time? Absolutely not. Everyone tells you no. But as scientists, we do live by uniformity of the rules. What does that mean? Well, what does that mean is that when we look at the strata of the earth, when you look at the fossils, how did we come up with that age of the fossils? Well, in some sense, they started to make experimentation. So this is the difference between evidence and experimentation. So they started to make modern experimentation with different kind of sediment and see how long does this take it for this sediment to settle down? How much time? Okay? And then they multiply by ratio and proportionality, okay, considering that all laws are going to be uniform. And they look now on the strata of the earth. They go into a place like the Grand Canyon. And they multiply and they look at the Grand Canyon and look at the strata and they say, well, if our current sediment took that time to get to that depth, if I multiply that by the Grand Canyon is X amount of years old. But what is the basic assumption I'm making here? Uniformity. That the laws that I came up now based on my experiment is the same laws that governed the formation of the Grand Canyon. This debate of uniformity, for example, is huge in radioactive tracing, in radioactive dating. Because one of the biggest arguments of young Earth creationists, they will tell you, how can you make the assumption that your current observation of radioactive decay is the same as it was, billions of years ago? It is a valid argument, but on the flip side of that, there is really nothing for us to make the assumption that there was anything different about radioactive decay, especially as I'm going to show you very quickly. Some of these radioactive isotopes, their half-life is measured in 1 billion years. Okay, if the half-life is 1 billion year, okay, it's really hard to imagine that could have changed. There is nothing within our knowledge or information to tell us that the uniformity of the law of radioactive decay should have changed over the age of this universe. Does that make sense? Another big example of uniformity, the speed of light. We live by the speed of light. If the speed of light changes, we would not even exist, right? So then when we are looking out in the universe and we see galaxies and we see stars that are receding away from us and we know that those are X amount of light years away from us, if we go by the uniformity of law of the speed of light, we have to absolutely, to some extent, believe that those stars and galaxies are X amount of years of light away from us. We take the rules that we're living by and make these deductions. So uniformitism is very, very important to science. Otherwise, science would not exist. Anyone who's done statistics knows statistical probability, knows it very well, and knows that how a little bit of data can change and then all your assumptions change. Knows very well in randomized trials. You come with a randomized trial that tells you, for example, that cholesterol treating medication works very well, and then after that they do another study and the statistical probability is not the same, and they tell us like, oh, we got it wrong. So anyone who's worked in science knows very well how hard it is to come up with scientific conclusions. Another thing in scientific data, And that's also one of the very, very tough battles between evidence-based science and experiment-based science. Because experiment-based science, they'll tell you, if you make a scientific claim based on an experiment, you have to put something that can be repeated, something that can be investigated, something that is testable, you can test it, and something is falsifiable. If you don't have those 4 criteria, it's not science. So let's say, for example, you know what, I'll come and tell you, I made an experiment, then out of this experiment, I made a new human baby, out of just a cell. Okay, it's an experiment. You'll come and tell me, well, you know what, hey, all right, you know what, I'll take you for whatever it's worth. But please show me the steps you've done in the experiment. Can I, as an independent lab, an independent investigator, can repeat that? Okay? Can I show in your steps falsibility? Can I show you where you were wrong in that? If you come and tell me, no, I don't think you can do that. Is it testable? Can I test that your hypothesis, your experiment? Is it repeatable? If you don't fulfill these criteria, then it's not science. The problem becomes when these criteria that are designed for experiment-based science get extrapolated for evidence-based science. Because in evidence-based science, a lot of these things, especially historical science, you cannot repeat it. You're not going to be able to repeat the fossils. Okay? You cannot test it. You can falsify it. You can falsify the facts, but mainly the falsification of the facts is dependent on how you're putting pieces of science together to come up with an interpretation. But in evidence-based, when you're looking at historical evidence and historical observation, most of the time you cannot test these hypotheses. There's no question, a big debate that we always come back to is when people say, well, you know what, evolution is just a theory. I actually don't think that is a fair statement. Because what is science? How do you come up with science? When you look at the logical sequence of science, science, when you're starting with something is completely new, a completely new finding. The first thing you come up is evidence. You're seeing evidence that you're not used to, evidence that to you looks strange, looks weird, looks different than the norm. You look after that on a hypothesis. You're making a hypothesis about the evidence that you're seeing. After this hypothesis, you make an experiment. After the experiment, you come up with a theory that explains what you've seen. And if the theory holds true for so long, it becomes a law. For example, look at gravity. What was the evidence for gravity? Well, Newton, the very famous story, he was sitting there and he saw the apple. That was evidence. He asked himself, well, what is the experimentation behind that? I'm sure he experimented a little bit behind this. He came up with a hypothesis. The hypothesis became a theory. The theory became a law. When you look at a theory, a lot of times, and this is what sometimes I think we get caught on as very naive Christian people who are in science. A lot of times when we say evolution is just a theory, we're mixing between a theory and a hypothesis. A hypothesis is something hypothetical. You're still making assumptions and you're still studying it. A theory is beyond a hypothesis. A theory actually has a lot of solid, valid foundational facts that support it. The problem with a theory is that it's still the understanding and the integration of all these facts together is incomplete, and I'll give you that. That is probably evolution. There's so many facts, and as I'll show you, there's so many facts behind evolution that exist and are absolute facts. There's no debate about it. The difference is how you integrate all these facts together into one cohesive theory. So it's the integration that is being debated, but not the facts. Does that make sense? So as we go from the argument, we're going to go very quickly from the cosmological argument. And in the cosmological argument, I think this is where a lot of the young earth creationists, I just don't buy it. I'll be very honest with you. I've read their books and I've read a lot of their research. And maybe their research about the creation of man and the evolution of man, you know what, they've got a lot to say about it. Because there's a lot of unknown. But to me, I have a very hard time understanding how they can put together the cosmological evidence, the astronomical evidence, that there are so many galaxies that are billions of light years away from us, and they say that the universe is 10,000 years old. I think it's really irreconcilable. They have theological interpretation, and I'm going to get into the next lecture about their theological interpretation of that. But from a scientific standpoint, I just cannot make any sense in their writings. How can the universe, I'm not talking about man, but how can the universe be 10,000 years old? Because the cosmological evidence of what we see in astronomy is just mind-boggling. And by the way, if we, for example, say, well, you know what, the light years are different in measurement, then our whole foundation as astrophysics is completely invalid. Because the measurement of the speed of light has been validated, and that's part of who we are as a universe. So to say that it is less than, 14 billion years, yes, it could be a bit of variation of the 14 billion years, but for sure it's not 10,000 years as a universe. But now you come to the beginning of life, and then to the beginning of mankind. And you would say, is mankind this, what we talk of as creation, instant creation, or this? When you look at most evolutionary paradigms that talk about evolution of man, that are about being between 4 to 5 million years old. Let's attempt to be clear that science should not be philosophy nor theology. So as much as I would say for Christians, do not take science as a way to prove the existence of God, because I don't think there's anything in the science from a scientific perspective that can prove God. I would also take it to point to people who are non-Christians and say, do not make that leap of faith in scientific evidence to say that there is scientific evidence that says that God does not exist. Your jump of faith, your leap of faith from the scientific evidence to say that God does not exist is a philosophical jump, is a theological jump. It's faith-based. Number two, do not judge a whole group with the evils of some of its members. There's definitely a lot of members in both camps that have really used a lot of rhetoric that is not good for the debate. I love it that when we meet, the end is near. Both the theologian and the scientist is saying the end is near, whether it's because of climate change or whether because of the doom that is pending. And finally, science and religion agree. So now let's get into some science. First of all, let me get out the radioactive dating out of the way. Because a lot of people are going to come and say, well, and I say, well, you know what, this fossil is 2 million years old. You come and tell me it was all cool. You know what? Radioactive dating has been proved to be wrong, so I don't buy that. Let's take this out of the way, because a lot of the work, and a lot of times when young earth creationists tackle this, they tell you, you know what, you're basing an assumption. Well, it's not an assumption that is based on nothing. What is radioactive dating when you look at it? It's very much the concept of the sand hourglass. You start on the top with a lot of sand, and then you look at the rate of how that sand is going down, and you look at the amount in the bottom. And based on this, you determine how much time has gone. Yes, you have to make some assumptions based on this. That number one, this is a closed system. There's no sand going in or sand that is leaking out of the system. Because if there is sand going in or sand leaking out, your assumptions are wrong. That's number one. That is an assumption. Number two is that the rate of the sand going through, the rate of the sand going through is constant, the rate of decay. Number three, that there is no elements, that are intermixed between them. So it is the concept of the sand hourglass. There's no question that the time of decay is exponential, not constant. As the radioactive material gets to its end of life, the rate of decay is going to be more. That does throw a little bit of a wrench, that for example, if you're using to date something and you're using a radioactive isotope that is almost at the end of its life, it's not going to be as accurate. If you use it within its half-life, it's probably going to be very accurate. You have to use the right isotope for the expected age. And when you look at this, actually, carbon-14, which has been dated, like the half-life is 6,000 years, works best for anything less than 45,000 years. But when you look at the amount of isotopes over there are isotopes, seriously, that have a half-life of 1 billion years. So one of the biggest debates about radioactive isotopes, you can't make a straw man argument and said, well, you've used this isotope and it doesn't work if you use the wrong isotope. If you're dating something that is in a matter of 1,000,000 years, you can't use radioactive carbon. Why? Because its half-life is only 6,000 years. Radioactive carbon works very well for modern man, something less than 10 to 20,000 years. But if you're talking about fossils, and this is one of the arguments you find a lot in young earth creationists, they'll tell you, well, radioactive carbon is only good for about 20 to 30,000 years. How come you're using it for longer than that? Well, guess what? They're not using radioactive carbon for dating fossils. As simple as this. So you can't make a straw man's argument, because then you'll appear to be very naive. There's been excellent correlation with tree age by growth ring. You know how they do this? So they find some very, very ancient trees. And they know the age of the tree from the growth rings. That this could be almost in a matter of like 40,000 years, 50,000 years, 60,000 years. And then they do the radioactive tracing and they correlate it with the age of the growth rings. And they find that it correlates very well. They've done other correlation when they've taken known volcanic eruptions. So they've taken volcanic eruptions that are known, that have happened in the history of mankind. And they'll take radioactive tracing of rocks that came out of these volcanic eruptions. And they'll find that those match. So in some sense, I find it very hard to completely discredit radioactive dating and say that it's a completely invalid science. And honestly, if we want to do our research in this, we have to be careful about what we are stating. So now let's come to evolution. The big E. Okay? It's the big elephant in the room, and everyone knows that. Before we go into evidence for evolution and evidence against evolution, we have to define what are we talking about. If you talk about evolution as a change over time, I doubt that any one of us would deny this. Why? Because you're all changing. You change your skin cells every couple of weeks. You change your blood cells every 3 weeks. You grow old. You have a defect in your genes and you end up with a cancer based on that. So change happens. However, the second definition is the mechanism responsible for the change. So number one is the change. Number two is the mechanism. The mechanism responsible for the change is natural selection. Natural selection. By the way, this theory was Darwin's original theory. What is natural selection? It basically means that stimuli or things that happen in the environment would cause you gradually that your genetic composition will change to give you a survival adaptability and a survival advantage. But that's called a natural selection, and it's usually a response to something. So that's the second definition. And you know what? There's a lot of evidence behind this, and I will show you more data. But the most simple one of the natural selection is how, for example, antibiotics there is resistance from bugs against antibiotics. Is that they develop resistance to it by both protein modification and genetic modification. So that is very well documented. However, saying that there is a third definition, and here we're not talking about the change, we're talking about the mechanism, that the mechanism responsible for the change is random variation. It is not a response to something that has happened in your environment. It just happened on a random basis, because if you look at all our genes randomly change by a constant rate. It is very well documented in the population studies and studies of organisms that there are random changes that happen in genes. It is not stimulated by anything in the environment. So then you can define evolution that the change over time happened primarily by random variation. This is the definition that the neo-Darwinist would adopt. That there is a change, and this change is forced or happens. The mechanism is 100% random, not natural selection. The fourth component of definition of evolution is that if you take the change and you take that it's random, and over the right amount of time, you will go from one cell, a single common ancestor, to have common descent, universal common descent. That all of us, as we see this creation as men and women, all of us as biological organisms have evolved over time by random process, random mutation from a single common ancestry. By the way, I'll tell you that there are a lot of very, very prominent Christian scientists that would believe evolution all the way until here. So let's not just hold your breath for a second. There are a lot of very, very prominent Christian scientists that will believe all the way to here. But then the fifth one, I think, is the philosophical one, and this is very hard to make it based on science, is that the change based on random is 100% going through an unguided, unintelligent, purposeless material process. The toughness of this definition is that it is very, very hard to define it from a scientific standpoint. Why? Because whatever is guiding the process is outside of it, correct? So it may or may not be governed by the laws of science. It is a philosophical assumption. And by the way, and I'm going to get to a little bit in details, random does not necessarily mean all the time and guided. So the current evolutionary paradigm, it is descent with modification. It's reconstruction of all evolutionary tree, showing that all organisms relate to a single primordial ancestor. And the mechanism, this is the most important word you might come out of it today. The mechanism that is responsible for this is random mutation as a primary way, with natural selection as a way of adaptation. But random mutation is the primary mechanism of how this happens. So if you go into most evolutionary biology books, this is the way, the paradigm that they would describe it. So now I'm going to tell you both sides of the story. I think number one, we have to start with evidence in favor of evolution. And by the way, here, evolution, I'm looking in favor of evolution from the process itself. What is the evidence that supports it? Let's start with fossil evidence. There's no question when you look at fossil evidence, it would make sense. Let's say that, you know what, we all started from this single cell, okay? And these single cells then evolve after that to more complex multicellular organisms. And then they go from multicellular organisms to even more complex. If you're going by a very basic assumption, the single and more simple cells have to be deeper in the fossils, okay, than the more complex. They have to be layered. And when they look at the fossil record in general, and I don't have time to go into all the minute details, but in general they find that that's the case, that the more simple organisms are deeper in the fossil record. You find that single cells are about 1 billion years old. When they look at the fossils and the dating of the rocks where those cells are embedded, they're about 1 billion years old. You start very, very quickly to look about the Cambrian explosion, the fish and the aquatic creatures, about 500 million years. Very quickly you start to see the amphibians, and you see the complexity of these organisms. They match a timeline. They match a timeline. The more complex come at a later time. The dinosaurs about 230 million years until you get into the Yucatan Peninsula, the catastrophe. And this has been shown by tons of studies that about 665 million years it happened at that time, the global catastrophe where at that point the dinosaurs were extinct. And based on these studies, they see that. So the timeline itself simply matches this. I think another thing which is called biogeography, it's a whole different field, and I think it's amazing. When you look at fossils on the west coast of Africa and fossils on the east coast of Latin America, where it was thought at some point in time that all these were connected, they find extremely compelling evidence that fossils that predated the separation of those continents exist on both. But then after the separation of those continents, you don't find them anymore. So what does that tell you in terms of the timeline? That timeline has been validated not only by by radioactive dating, but also by finding the different kind of fossils. So for example, when you find a fossil in a certain strata of a certain age, you go to a different part. So you find one in America, and then you find another one in China, for example. China has been getting a lot of fossils lately. And you find that they are matching in the same age. That, to some extent, uniformitism confirms the findings that you have. And then when you find really, really old ones that predated the continents from separating, it gives you some sense that this timeline that you have come up with is somewhat valid. The transition forms are extremely debated, and I will tell you, transition forms for fossil records are very much like statistics for medical professions, because it's very hard to make absolute assumptions, and each side has a very good argument. But one of the biggest examples they give about transition forms for favor of evolution, you look at the transition from the reptiles to the mammals. In the mammals in general, you've got 3 ear bones that are inside the ear, which is what you use to hear, okay, inside there. Those 3 bones, at some point, okay, based on these transition forms, they believe that they were in the reptiles and the amphibians in the jaw. Why? Because they needed a jaw to chew on their food. But as the amphibians had less need to eat big things, those jaw bones kind of recessed up until all the way they became into the ear, which were then used for hearing. Is this absolute solid fact? I don't think so, but it's very compelling when you see the transition over reptiles, okay, of certain structures that are used for different functions. When they look also at the fossils and they look at what's called homology, homology means that the body organisms look alike across different creatures or different mammals. When you look at the arms and the limbs of the rat, and you look at the bird, and you look at the man, you look at the monkey, and you look at the construction and the way that they are looking alike, that homology, okay, to some extent tells people, well, you know what, you can trace the change over time in these fossils. So that's the fossil evidence. And I think the biggest factor in the fossil evidence, I believe, is how that fossil evidence increases by complexity as time goes on. Okay? I think that is one of the most compelling evidence for it. Genetic evidence. When you look at the very well-known tree of life, it has been very well documented by constant models of mathematical computation of genetics, is that the closer you are to other organisms on the tree of life, your genetic similarity increases quite a bit, in a general sense. So, for example, between us and the closest mammal that we know, which is the chimp, our genetic similarity is far, far more than other mammals, such as the mouse. And it's mathematically computed that the closer you are on that tree of life, that similarity is extremely well. So for example, if you look at the man, if you look at the humankind gene, and you look at the chances that you'll find a gene sequence that codes for protein, so something that is functional, something that makes us very close in a function, there's almost 100% chance you'll find it in the chimpanzee, but within the roundworm, 35%. Why? Because basically we are closer on the tree of life in terms of similarity. But when you look at the genetic component, okay, that genetic component is extremely high. So at this point, you're looking at the tree of life not from a point of outside, well, hey, you look like a chimp, so you must be closer to the chimp than the mouse. No, you've done genetic study, and you look at the genetic study, and you find that the genetic similarity is far more on that tree of life to coincide. Some people will come and say, well, who told you that means that it's a common ancestry? Why can't it be function? If we and the chimps have the same function, for example, that we use our legs to move around, that we use our hands to eat, okay? So there's a matter of function. Why can't it be a factor that function dictates genes? So if 2 creatures or 2 organisms have similar functions in their biological functions, their genes will match. But there is actually debate against that, because you'll find something, for example, like the bat, okay? The bat functions like a bird. Right? But its genes are absolutely much, much, much closer and identical to the mouse and the rat than the bird. So if it was a matter of function, you would have expected the bat to have genes that are similar to the bird. But because of molecular similarity and as a family, as in terms of where it potentially came from, it is closer to the mice and the rat. This is one of the toughest debates, and this is where you get into this really politically contested area of pseudogenes and junk DNA, and how dare we say that something is junk DNA when we don't know how it works. But you find something very similar, and I think the next two slides are some of the strongest evidence of genetic similarity of common ancestry. For whatever it's worth, from a scientific standpoint, listen to those two slides. Because if there's one thing that makes me compelled to actually agree with common ancestry, and I may be shot for this, but from a scientific standpoint, these are the slides. It's kind of interesting when you look at the mapping of the genes of the whole biological, the family, or the tree of life. Not only you find similarity in genes that code for proteins, and these genes that code for proteins are more similar as these organisms are closer in the family of the tree of life, but also in areas that genes do not code. These are non-coding genes. Those are sometimes called pseudogenes, sometimes called junk DNA, sometimes called ancient repetitive AREs, sorry. I blank on the last word. You find that actually, when we look at organisms that are on the same family tree on us, our similarity is not only in the gene, but in the dysfunctional area between the genes that doesn't code for anything. And you would think, why would a dysfunctional area that does nothing, that is actually truncated means that the complete part of it is completely missing. Why would it be kept in us as an organism from one person to the other? Why would it be similar between our genome and the mouse genome? Why would our chromosomes be like that? If it's a matter of only genes that code for protein, why would these genes that don't code for anything, and I would give you this, there's been a lot of debate because there are a lot of areas of the genome that are silent. And we have to admit we don't know their function, and we might find their function as science changes. But there is also no question that there are some genes that have been sequenced in areas that don't code for genes that are found to be defective. Why would you inherit a defective gene, and why would that gene be similar between your genome and a mouse genome? In fact, when you look at cats, the whole cat family, cats, lions, tigers, pumas, they can trace based on the fossil evidence that at some point they lost the receptor to taste sweet things. They lost that receptor, and when they look at that receptor and they map it, they find it defective in all the family. It's kind of interesting, they find it in the same place. On the genome, they find it in the same place, and they find it's defective on them. And you would have to wonder, why is that? What about evolution of man? You all know this from a lot of the books that talk about how, for about 4 or 5 million years, you get these species. You know, the Australopithecus, and then after that, the Neanderthals, the Homo erectus, and then all the way until the Homo sapiens. And the question, one of the biggest debates, and I will tell you this, one of the biggest debates right now, are these precursors or ancestors of mankind, or were these parallel lines of creation that got extinct at some point, just like dinosaurs? That's a very important point. And by the way, this is not only theologians and Christians who are debating this, there are scientists. Because you'll find a lot of theologians who will tell you, well, you know what do you think about caveman? Okay? What do you think about Neanderthals? And they will tell you, well, you know what, I think those were creatures created by God, not in the line of mankind, and they got extinct for any reason that we don't know. So from a scientific standpoint and from a theological standpoint, there's a lot of debate. Are these ancestors, or are these parallel lines? So let's go on the same thing. What is genetic evidence? Pay attention. It's kind of amazing, really humbling. When you look at the chimp chromosome line and the man chromosome line, it lines up quite a bit. It lines up really, really nice. And it's kind of fact interesting that the chimp chromosome is 24. There are 24. The man is 23. But it's kind of interesting when you look at it that 2A and 2B out of the chimp chromosome fuse to make man's chromosome number 2. And in fact, scientists are working there looking at where has this link, where did they fuse together? But they find it that it's just not only that there is a similarity, almost the sequencing is very close. They look at actually when they do the genetic similarity between man and chimp, and they look at the Neanderthal, okay? So going by that same assumption, the closer you are on the tree of life, the closer your genetic similarity has to be. And they find it even with the chimps and the Neanderthal, that is there. One of the other assumptions, and I showed you this between the mouse gene and the human gene. As history goes by, you will find more and more defective genes in the non-coding areas that accumulate. Why? Because they're not working, and they're non-coding, so it doesn't kill you. So as you see the more historical specimens to compare to the specimens that are more recent, you find in the more recent, there is more abundance of genes that are non-functioning in the non-coding area. What does that tell you? It tells you that as time went by, we as a race accumulated more and more non-functioning genes, if you take it by the fact that we evolved. Okay? So when you look at these specimens across time, you find that interesting. This is one of the toughest slides to come across. So you all know very well sailors who went on the sea for long journeys. What disease did they get? Scurvy. Why did they get scurvy? Vitamin C. So why do we need vitamin C? Say again? Bones, integrity of the skin, integrity of the immune system, integrity of the mouth. There's many things. So how come we don't have a gene that makes us, resistant to that? Look at this. So most mammals have a gene, including the dog, the cow, and the rat. They have a gene that codes for vitamin C. They do not need to have supplementation of vitamin C. It's called the GULO gene, gluconolactone oxidase gene. And they find something very interesting. In this line, this gene that codes for the vitamin C becomes defective in specimens that date back almost 200,000 years. And then when it became defective, every part, every organism beyond that line has that gene defective. It's very puzzling. I will be very honest to tell you, it's very puzzling. Because not only you're mapping this gene, you find it in the same location in all those three organisms, the human, the chimpanzee, and the orangutan. You find the gene in that same location, and you find the same defect in that location between all of those creatures. Very puzzling. And I'm not saying this to shake your faith in anything, because I have the answers at the end that I came up with, but I can just want to tell you how difficult an area of research it is. Because if you would endorse a certain theological line of thought, let's say instant creation, you have to come up with theological answer and a scientific answer for why would you have a defective gene that shares the same location as other organisms on that tree of life. Very puzzling. When you look at actually another gene called the FOXP2 gene, animals don't speak, okay? Animals don't speak, we know that. They found a gene called the FOXP2 gene that mutated. When they go back to specimens and they look at the mutations, they found this gene specifically about 100,000 years ago in the parallel lines that were within the Homo sapien, Homo erectus, and this line, the Neanderthals. And they find that this gene mutated about 100,000 years ago. Was this the introduction of speech to these creatures? Nobody really knows, but it is. You remember when I talked about evidence-based, like historical science, and making the assumptions? So people who find this evidence, they cannot go back in time and repeat a test, but they're making the hypothesis that about that time, that's when speech was introduced. What goes against this is that, yes, you're absolutely right, chimps don't have that, orangutans don't have that, monkeys don't have that. But one thing that goes against it, very interestingly, mice, they found that some of them have that gene mutation. Very interesting. So in some sense, as an evidence, it is compelling to believe that at some point about 100,000 years ago, the ability of speech was introduced. By the way, how did they find out that this gene existed? Very interesting. They found a family in the United Kingdom. This family, in several generations, were not able to speak, had no ability to speak. And when they sequenced their genes, they found that this gene, the FOXP2, was the one gene that was common between all of them. It's observational. I don't think you can experiment with it because we're the only organism that has the ability to talk, right? So if you want to change any one of us, well, who wants to stay silent for the rest of their life? But on some sense, it is very compelling evidence that could have this happened. Now, this is an area which becomes extremely hard for the point of ancestry. Was Adam and Eve one couple out of which all humanity came? And I will talk in details about the biblical text in the next lecture. But from a biological standpoint, you guys know very well what's called an allele. So when you've got two chromosomes and you've got the two pairs of a certain gene are identical, if one of them changes, that other one becomes a different allele. So they find something very interesting on what's called the histocompatibility complex antigens. Okay, Henny knows that very well from the cancer research, okay, immunology in terms of organ transplant. They find that mankind, the 6 billion that we have around the earth right now, out of this, there are 150 alleles that exist. Here's what population scientists do. They say the average rate, and remember the rule of uniformitism, it's uniform. The average rate of mutations in the current population is once per, let's say, I don't know the exact numbers, but once per 200 years. Okay? And when they multiply the witnessed, the observed rate of mutation of those genes in the current population, and they extrapolate by mathematical models the number of different alleles that we have at this point, and they do a simple calculation back in time, it tells you that mankind, if we assume the same rate of mutation, that mankind should be about 150 years old. And it was biologically impossible for it to be one person, to like a pair, that would be responsible, but rather what's called the bottleneck population of 10,000 people in Africa. An extreme amount of research that is in this area. But what is it based all upon? The law of what? Uniformity. That the observed rate of mutations of such histocompatibility complex antigens genes is the same now as it was 100,000 years ago. In the absence of, let's say, a nuclear event or something like that. But this is where the genetic diversity becomes into play. And when they look at the continents, okay, between Europe and Asia and Africa and the overlapping point of these genes, and they can trace them back. Another argument for them is this whole idea of the junk DNA, ancient repetitive elements, sorry, that's what is it? And then what they think of as a design that was imperfect. And I would give you this, that this is also being very debated, because one of the biggest examples they give is the eye, and how the eye, the receptors that sense light are behind the blood vessels, and they think that this is an imperfect design, because the blood vessel is kind of almost in the way of the light going into these receptors. So it's kind of designed upside down. There's a lot of research that now completely argue against this. That actually there is a reason, and part of our saying it's an imperfect design is that we don't know yet all the details of this design and why it's designed like that. The whole idea of the junk DNA, well, there is a lot of areas that were deemed to be junk, deemed to be ineffective, deemed to be doing nothing, that we are now discovering that have quite a bit of information in it. The panda's thumb has been an extremely hot topic for biologists because they think it's a very dysfunctional organ or unit for the panda, doesn't do anything with it, and yet it inherited from prior ancestors to it. The appendix, although I would tell you, no, there's a lot of research about how the appendix has a function. So, what we've done so far is that I've given you scientific evidence to at least say that the evolutionary paradigm of common ancestry is plausible. Is plausible. I don't think we've proven anything, but I think the evidence we're seeing, that's where the theory comes in, is when you take all these pieces of information and can you come up with a cohesive scientific answer to these findings that you're witnessing in this day and age and find out what is the mechanism behind it. You find scientists who would adopt evolutionary biology and say, well, you know what, the mechanism that explains all this is a complete random process of evolution by random mutation of genes. That will be somebody like Richard Dawkins. Okay? However, there are Christian scientists who believe almost in the same findings. They're not doubting the findings. And they would potentially agree with Richard Dawkins that the common ancestry is very plausible because of the presence of these pseudogenes, the presence of things like the vitamin C gene, and they would say it is biologically very plausible. However, what they would debate with Richard Dawkins is that when you are saying the mechanism is random and you really don't have a way to prove that it's absolutely random, because you almost have to be outside of the mechanism to say it's a random, they're saying that this is guided. And this is the evidence they give against evolution. I think for most evolutionary biologists who talk about evolution and talk about all what we've just mentioned, one of the Achilles heel areas for them, which is really, really, really critical, is how did life begin? There is no valid and suitable mechanism at this point for how life started, okay? What's called the abiogenesis. How did this whole first cell come? There has been in the University of Chicago the very famous experiment of Miller and Urey. But this, and what they did basically, I know you guys know it from science very well, but they basically had, okay, what was called a prebiotic soup. And then through this, they sparked electricity, okay, and they came up with this with amino acids. But there are some really important caveats about this test that are very, very critical. Number one, the atmosphere in this contained 0 oxygen. 0 oxygen. Why? Because if you have oxygen and you put a spark in it, what happens? Explodes. And there has been significant amount of research looking at the crust of the earth. These are actually people who are actually working into rocks and soil that tell you that based on the evidence that we have and based on the analysis of gases that are trapped in the rocks, at the time of the earth when it cooled down to the point of starting of biological life, it had oxygen. It had oxygen, absolutely. And in fact, the percentage of oxygen was documented anywhere between 15 to 20%. So then at that point, it makes this experimental model just not valid. Just not valid. The second question, as we all know, anyone who's done biology would tell you very well that, you know what, amino acids are not the building, they are the building, they're the blocks, okay? They're the bricks, but they're not the intelligent pattern of building. You see the difference? They are the bricks. If I'm building a wall like this and I put the wall, the amino acids are the bricks that I'll put in there. But there has to be an intelligent pattern behind which I'm building the wall in this pattern, correct? What is this intelligent pattern? This intelligent pattern is DNA and RNA. That is the blueprint based on which organisms are built. There have been a lot of research trying to see that whether DNA can be duplicated from this experiment, and it's failed. So then they're reversing now and saying that it's possibly RNA, because RNA is very interesting. RNA can work as a blueprint as also as a laborer at the same time. RNA gives you the pattern, but also can build by attracting amino acids based on the code. No matter what the research has said, there has not been any valid mechanism yet for the start of life. Fossil record, what's the evidence against it? That most fossil record based on the Cambrian explosion, if you would have expected time to allow things to evolve, you would expect that the organisms would appear gradually and you'll see these transition in the fossil record. Yet most fossil record to this day shows two things that are very interesting. Number one, they appear suddenly. Number two, they disappear suddenly. If you would have made the assumption that they had evolved, okay, how come they all appear at the same time? And when they appear, by the way, they appear at different levels of complexity. And sometimes, especially the Cambrian explosion, is the one Achilles heel of that explanation. What are more modern arguments against it from those who endorse evolution biology? They'll tell you the Cambrian explosion, the fossil record, doesn't tell you when it started. It tells you when something catastrophic happened and when it ended. And when it ended, just like, the Yucatan Peninsula, when it took out the dinosaurs, at that time there was a lot of diversity in life. And when it ended, something catastrophic came and took it out, and it was all a snapshot in time and history that captured them at this. So it's not capturing their beginning, it's capturing their end. All this is also looking at evidence and making your own interpretation out of it. But clearly, the fossil record doesn't show gradual transition. It shows that from the time of evolution, many organisms happen in the beginning. Question of the transitional forms, it's all in the eye of the beholder. If I see a fossil that looks like just a little bit between a bird and an amphibian reptile, I'll tell you, this form is the missing link. But somebody will come out and tell you, I don't see that. I don't see that. And that is the problem with observational science. Okay? You're taking this, and it's debated whether the Archaeopteryx is the first avian form. It was the transition from a reptile to a bird. This actually has been discredited lately because they found actually birds prior to the Archaeopteryx. So if this was the ancestor of the birds, there was this transitional form from a reptile up to a bird, you would not expect any birds prior to it. And that has been proven that there were birds prior to it. So the transitional forms are very difficult. If you expect by genetic biology, a gradual transition in the genes to make a change in what you're seeing, wouldn't you expect to see millions of fossil records of these forms and to show this gradual? Wouldn't you? Yes, and we don't see that. However, scientists who are against this will tell you we are lucky that we even have some fossils because the conditions on which fossils are made are extremely rare. We're lucky to have this even. So based on what we find, don't be too demanding. But then the scientist on the other side will tell you, you haven't proven your point yet. Because if you really truly believe that evolution went on these gradual steps, we need to have some evidence. There is no question, hands down, the evidence of transitional forms is extremely rare. Does it not exist? No, it does exist. It does exist. But it's extremely rare, and it's not as enough as you would expect. And that would be a big debate. Problems with genetics. So remember we talked about in the pro, there was genetic evidence and fossil evidence. Now we're going to do the same thing with against. Well, if we are about 98% of genetics similarity between us and the chimp, how do you explain this amazing diversity? It's there is a lot of things that are different. If you as somebody who is pro-evolutionary biology are claiming the evidence of genetic similarity between me and the chimp, I can take the argument the same way. Well, if it is that similar, how come we're different? And that would tell you, bottom line, that is, we don't know enough. It is not all about the genetic similarity. Could the genetic similarity be the fact that we just share the same biosphere? When I eat, steak, if that steak is made out of a genetically different composition that I can tolerate, well, I'm not going to be able to eat it. So the biosphere, because we eat plants, we eat animals, and we have to be able to digest it and incorporate it in our own body. So it's not a matter necessarily of that it's a similar ancestry as much as a similar biosphere. Only a fraction of the genome is yet discovered yet, and we have to be humble about that. Junk DNA is still to be discovered. As I said, within the last 10 to 15 years, there's been amazing discoveries in junk DNA that basically show that the areas that we think are not coding for protein are key in turning on and off when protein is being made. So although they may not have the genetic sequence for the protein, they have the signals of when to turn it on and to turn it off. There's no agreement on the molecular phylogenetics. And now, the last point. The last point. If the mechanism of biological evolution through neo-Darwinism is random mutations, and if you would hold by the same assumption that scientists would use, that rules should be what? Uniform. Okay, let's study nowadays what mutations look like and see if we can make the same uniform law and put it back to history and see if it makes sense. When you look at mutations, and they use the peppered moth experiment, most mutations that are witnessed at the current state, in fact almost all of them, are microevolution, are adaptation. That's what has been seen. Most mutations, and this is one of the tenets of Michael Behe's book, it's a really good book, and I think he, as a scientist, analyzes it very well. He tells you as follows. Mosquitoes that carry malaria and human beings lived together for tens of thousands of years. And mosquitoes, okay, at some point in time, the hemoglobin of one person in Africa changed from normal hemoglobin to sickle cell hemoglobin. As a carrier, it gave her resistance against malaria. Michael Behe raises a very interesting question. If two organisms live together for that long a period of time, and malaria and its rate of change and its rate of mutation is faster than human beings, and the number of organisms are in trillions. So now you've got the matter of time, you've got the number of organisms, and you've got something that actually is resisting the malaria. Why can't malaria change its genome to be able to infect people with sickle cell anemia? Sickle cell hemoglobin is still very resistant to malaria. And there's a reason for that. Malaria, when it develops resistance to drugs, it's usually one gene change, and usually sometimes a protein. If it would change its system to counteract sickle cell, it will have to change a complete DNA change. And yet you get an organism that has multiplied trillions of times, has a reason to bring on a new function of survival, and yet you don't see this. He makes another example. When you look at HIV virus and you look at E. coli, HIV has changed its composition as a genetic composition over the last 30 years at least 40 to 50 times. And HIV, anyone who knows HIV patients knows that the virus duplicates in trillions. So the matter of time and the matter of replications and the potential of mutation is there. Has it changed into anything different? No. And that's why he called his book The Edge of Evolution. Is that based on what we're seeing right now in terms of mutations, if you take the same laws and put them back, this is Michael Behe's word, I cannot fathom that random mutation can explain such diversity. Because a random mutation cannot, even in this day and age, in organisms that replicate so much, such as HIV, E. coli, and malaria, is unable to do that when it has every reason to adapt and survive, such in the case of sickle cell anemia. Most mutations are harmful. The fruit fly, they tried with so many experiments to change the genes, and they brought up the gene that made it have 4 wings. But the reality is that even though they changed it, it's still a fly, that's number one. Number two, it was harmful for it because actually it made it debilitated. And we know very well from our current evidence that most mutations, Dr. Haney can tell you that very well, most mutations end up in what? Congenital disease, genetic abnormalities, biochemical deficiencies, and cancer. And that's what we see. We have not seen at the evidence any other mutations. Last thing, there has been not, and this is a very strong criticism against biological evolutionary scientists. However, they're telling you we're still working on it. That's their answer. There has not been a mechanism that they have identified. How can an organism make this leap and change its complete nature and become a different species? Because they think of genetic mutations, there's something called the saltation. Saltation means basically a jump. So mutation is one gene. A saltation is that multiple genes in the same time and in the same instant would change. The problem with gradual change of genes one after the other is that the change that happens one at a time leads defective organisms that cannot survive. So to go from a malaria that can combat sickle cell, you have to change about 3 genes in the same time. That's it, 3 genes. If you change it one at a time, you have a defective malaria organism. So then the question becomes, how can you change 3 genes in the same time? And there has not been any scientific mechanism that has been proposed, whether in evidence or experiment, to support that. Are they working on it? Absolutely. One of the theories that they make is that you've got a gene such as gene A, and it duplicates into 2 genes. They're both identical, and you need just 1 gene to do the coding for the function it's doing. So you've got an accessory gene right now that basically is given a break, if they may say. So this other gene can go and modify and do something different, okay? While the original gene, gene A, is doing the function that it's supposed to do. So that's one of the mechanisms that has been proposed. Has it been proven? No. So this is the lay of the land of our Christian scientists. You've got on one side the creationists, okay, who really don't believe in neo-Darwinism or Darwinism. And then you've got the 2 camps in the middle, the intelligent design and theistic evolution. The difference between them is very, very interesting. There's no question that I can tell you, there is definitely a group of scientists that do not agree with Darwinism as a random mechanism that explains everything. They're not debating evolution. They're debating whether randomness can account for that. If you actually go on this website, www.descentfromdarwin.org, you'll find actually some very, very prominent scientists on this list. Extremely prominent. There still are, a minority. There are about 800 to 900 scientists. But what they're saying is that we are not debating biological evolution. We're not debating common ancestry. A lot of them actually agree with common ancestry. What they're debating is the randomness of the mechanism, that as a scientific system, it cannot explain what's happening. You get intelligent design. Intelligent design, which is pioneered by people like Philip Johnson, pioneered by somebody like William Dembski, Michael Behe. What do they propose? They propose as follows, that the evidence that we're seeing based on the genetic modification of organisms is so complex and so intricate that the chances of this information being transmitted from one organ to organ in a random fashion is just not plausible. They don't look at a gap and they say, well, you know what, we can't explain this gap scientifically, hence God is in this. They don't look at this. They really defend their case that they're not a God of the gaps people. You know what they look at? They look at information, and when they see the information looking extremely complex, they see a pattern. And in this pattern, they say, well, you know what, an intelligent mind must have had this pattern. They make it basically that, I want to read this to you. ID makes claims that design is detectable, but makes no claims about the discrete location of the design activity. And they look at it in terms of the simplest kind of argument is if you look at the difference between the Grand Canyon and Mount Rushmore. They're both huge structures. They're both amazingly beautiful structures. They're both really mind-boggling structures. But one of them is a random structure, the other one has a message on it. There is an intelligent message on it. Although they both look the same, in some sense, they're both made out of rock. They're both big, and they're both complex. But one of them has kind of an intelligent message, and this is what they go back and look at, is that if you look at the cell and you look at the flagellum, the amount of complexity in those organisms and the amount of information. In fact, one of their most prominent scientists right now, whose name is Stephen Meyer, amazing guy, had his PhD from, I think, Cambridge or Oxford, is taking it from a mathematical standpoint. And he is looking at the information that is put in a cell, in the genetic composition of a cell. and looking at the probability of this information to be gathered all in the same time or versus time. And he'll come up with the conclusion that, you know what, it's now a matter of information. That complexity of information is a pattern to be detected. Intelligent design is not against evolution. Intelligent design is not against evolution from one cell ancestry. A lot of people misunderstand this, by the way. Like people like Michael Behe, Darwin's black box, you would think that he is against a single cell ancestry. No, he's not. He actually does believe in a single cell or a common ancestry. He thinks that natural selection is the most common thing that we see in microevolution. He believes that random mutations happen, but when they happen, the outcome is disastrous. So they cannot account, random mutation cannot account for life going from point A, which is single cell ancestry, to point B, our current state. Very, very critical distinction. ID weakness, remember that first slide about science? Okay? When you're making this scientific theory of information, is it falsifiable? It's really hard. Can you test it? Really hard. Is it experimental or more evidence? It's more evidence. And that's the biggest argument against them. Some people ask if his design is fully controlled, because basically what an ID person says is that I believe that from point A of common ancestry to point B, which is us, evolution has happened, but it has been guided by an intelligent mind, has been designed and overlooked by an intelligent mind. And that's why they call it intelligent design. So the question becomes, and they come attack to this, if it is an intelligent design like this, why are there forms of design that are just malfunctional? Why are parts of the gene malfunctional if it's caused by an intelligent designer? So such, it's a tough one. On the other side, you get somebody like theistic evolution. Theistic evolution is very interesting. And I know I've ran a little bit more than time, but just bear with me 5 minutes. If any one of you is challenged at school or in their own college with science, evolution, and faith, I would really encourage you to read the works of a man by the name of Francis Collins. Francis Collins is an evangelical Christian who comes from a very, very conservative evangelical background. He's a gene scientist. That's his area. He works in genes. And he was commissioned by President Clinton to be the head of the Human Genome Project. And he was the one that led the team to discover our human genome. Such an amazing feat that actually when he wrote a book, he called his book The Language of God. He thought that the genetic sequence that came up, that was the way that God was speaking to us. Francis Collins was then nominated by Obama to be the head of the NIH. He's the one that actually sits on the organization that gives us money to do medical research. Francis Collins is a believer in God, and he believes in our Lord Jesus Christ. Yet he fully believes in evolution. And he fully believes that evolution was from a single cell ancestry to our current complex status. You would tell me, well, how is this compatible? And he says it's theistic evolution. God has the power and has the ability to override and guide the process and let the process take its time. He can override and guarantee the outcome, even though he would use evolution as a mechanism. Does he subscribe to evolution in a complete philosophical sense that it's all naturalism? No. He believes that God supervises all this. And his book is very interesting, called The Language of God. However, theologically, is removing God too much? Because the people who are against Francis Collins would say, well, you know what, here's what you're saying, Francis. You're saying that God made the factory called life, called nature, called evolution, and let it bring the outcome, which is us. Is God removed too much from it? Is your God is a God of a deist? That, you know what, started the beginning and then at the end removed his hand. If evolution is the model that we were all came up with, where does the moral law come from? Where does the Spirit of God, where does the knowledge of God come from? So there have been some really, really interesting evolutionary biology models that talk about how the evolution of morality came from the genetic standpoint. Very interesting. However, if I talk to Francis Collins as a Christian believer, where did the Spirit come from? And if you would say, well, the Spirit came directly from God's intervention and He gave us the Spirit, why can't God intervene in other parts of our biological development? If you allowed one exception, why can't you allow others? And Francis Collins will come and say, well, biologically, God let us develop in a biological sense because our body biologically doesn't look any different than any other organism. But our personhood, what is special about us, is the Spirit of God. That came from God. So when you read his book, The Language of God, okay, he would tell you that biologically, we have evolved through the biological mechanism. But when it came from the knowledge of God, Francis Collins, who's the head of the NIH project, believes that this was a special gift and a special intervention of God. That's where his belief is. Is fully endorsed evolution theologically sound? Unguided could be random. Does God play dice? Does God take random chances? Does God not guarantee the outcome? So an evolutionary biologist would say that, you know what, the process didn't have us in mind. We could have happened, we could have not happened. Is God who is in control? Can God guide an unguided process? I think that's a philosophical question. So to end, I would like to back and say that in evolution, there are so many competing scientific theories. I don't think you need to be completely taken off balance if you don't believe in evolution or if you do, because there is science on both sides. I think you need to go and do your homework. I think the genetic evidence and the fossil evidence is very, very, very difficult to handle, but you need to do your homework. I think at the end, I hope that at least you believe, whether we evolved from a cell or we are created instantaneously, that in both cases, we are created for good works that our Lord Jesus Christ has set for us for all ages. That is the image. And what I can leave you with is that there are scientists who are truly Christian, truly professing and confessing in Christ, on both sides of the argument. And I would encourage you to read their works and do your own research. Thank you for your time and for your attention. I know we've truly gone over. You know, this was planned actually to be potentially like 2 talks with a break in between, but thank you for staying with me. So, Dr. Hani, should we take a break with questions or start questions? Okay. All right. We can start questions. If anyone, I know there's probably a lot of biology students who have lost questions. There you go. So there's a question here. If you guys feel, if you want to just stand up and stretch, feel to do that, okay? Just stand up and stretch. We're going to take some questions and then have a break and then come back. Go ahead.
When you were discussing God guiding the random process of evolution, can you draw a parallel between that and a scientist doing an experiment that's randomized? Like, is there...
Well, first of all, in a randomized experiment trial that a scientists do, they really don't know the outcome of the experiment. So that's why they're doing it at random, to take out all the variables that could screw up the tests. Okay? That's a little bit different than God, because God knows the outcome of the experiment. At least if I believe in the omnipotence of God, okay, and His omniscience, okay, is different than the scientist who's doing a randomized experiment. However, saying that, how can theologically God guide an unguided process? The reality is that the way that I look at it, and maybe that's a wrong way to look at it, but when I look at an unguided process, I'm looking at it from my perspective, that the mutation in my genes as me, as George, don't have me in their mind as whether favorable or unfavorable. I could have a mutation, then tomorrow end up with cancer, okay? But God, who knows and is overriding and is looking and is omnipotent over the whole universe and humanity, including me and many others, okay, knows the outcome of what this is happening. When He allows a mutation to happen for me, He's allowing it, okay, for a certain reason. Okay, so it's not necessarily he's guiding and like just completely random and it just doesn't happen. Okay, the other thing about creation of mankind, I think I have a very hard time with people that say in the evolutionary paradigm man could have potentially not come up. No, I think God had in his mind in eternity to create mankind. Okay, whether the process went through evolution or not, that is a scientific debate. Okay, but the process and its end result, which is us, is predicted and known and guaranteed by God. In fact, our church fathers, and this is one of the beauty things, they say that, you know what, when God created man, he had in his mind the image of our Lord Jesus Christ, who would take on flesh and be like that. And to create man is not necessarily just in the way that we look and the way that we are shaped, but in our dignity, in our personhood, in our glory. The glory of the Son of God, our Lord Jesus Christ, is the glory that was given to us after our redemption. So the randomness of the process looks from our standpoint because we are limited in our knowledge. But I think when God is guiding it with his wisdom as an omnipotent and an omniscient God is a different story. Okay? But this is a philosophical question, not a scientific question. Because from a scientific standpoint, with us limited by our rules, it is random. Yes? Oh, sorry, he has the microphone. So go ahead, and then we'll give it to you.
Just wanted to first say thank you. This is perhaps the first time I heard a public speaker go through pretty much accurately a lot of the scientific evidence. Some of the debates concerning the idea of random selection or randomness in general, I feel like there is a certain semantic issue with that as well. Same thing with theory, because sometimes when atheists talk about randomness, it does not always mean randomness in the layman's perspective. There is still some sort of guided perspective using the laws of science. So I just wanted
That's
if
an
you can touch on that.
extremely well taken point. And this is, thank you very much for pointing this out, because this is actually a point that I failed to mention. Randomness does not equate into unguided. Okay? Randomness is a scientific phenomena. Guided or unguided is a philosophical and a theological phenomena. So randomness does not mean unguided. It could appear random from a biological standpoint, but it's guided. And you're absolutely right. Semantics, sometimes they can use the word inappropriately in a philosophical sense, not a scientific sense. So sometimes you'll find a scientist who would come and say, the process is random. And what they mean by is philosophically that the beginning and the instigation and the overriding of the whole process is unguided and random. And that's not true. Yes?
Why did I got selected then if all organisms came from a certain or one cell? Why not the chimpanzee got selected, or God came to rescue chimpanzees and I'm not? So my question is, am I selected because like I'm the top of the food chain, or what's the reason?
That's a great question. However, I would probably start by answering, this is not a scientific question. This is a philosophical question. And a scientist, and I agree with you that science and philosophy overlap. But in some sense, I think that we have to realize that we get our message of God and how God deals with us from the biblical revelation, not from our biological composition or our biological status. Because from a biological composition and a biological status, the evidence that I showed you can give a compelling story to say that we had a common ancestor. However, the glory of mankind is not in its body. The glory of mankind is in its spirit, in its thought, in its free will, in its creativity. The glory of mankind is in its relationships. The glory of mankind is in how we as a community deal with each other. I think none of these factors that I mentioned are inherently tied with the biology. Because in fact, if it is the biology, we share with with other organisms, the same food, the same environment, the same illness and sickness and death. So why is it me, not a chimpanzee? I think because God, when He looks at mankind, He looks at mankind as the image and likeness in the form that He related to them. The question becomes, how did we get to that form? Do you see what I'm saying? The evolutionary biologist who believes in Jesus Christ would tell you we got to that form and we evolved over time, and then when we were at the right intelligence and the right complexity and the right understanding and the right appreciation of God, God breathed into us the breath of life, which is the relationship and the spirit, and started the relationship and started the biblical revelation at that time. And that's when we see in the biblical account. That's how they interpret it. I'm not saying that this is what's right and what's wrong. That's their interpretation. So somebody like Francis Collins will never debate and say, well, we're not on the image and likeness of God. He will tell you that when we evolved through the evolutionary mechanism to the point that we were complex enough to become understanding and appreciating of the divine existence and relationship, God started the relationship. And the image and likeness is not confined or limited to how the body is made or how the body looks like. That is his opinion. Does it have some validity? There is some validity to it. Yes, I will, I don't know if I want to say this, but I'll come and say it. And I think this is a point of, it tells you how tough it is. If you ask me as George, what do I think about this matter? I will tell you biologically, I am more and more inclined to believe in common ancestry for many, many different reasons. I would probably be more in the camp of the intelligent design that would say, somebody like Michael B. would say, common ancestry makes a lot of sense in many things that I'm witnessing. Yes, the mechanism is not random, and the mechanism is not neo-Darwinist, naturalistic randomness of evolution. The mechanism is much more likely intelligently designed by an intelligent mind. Okay? But theologically and biblically, which is going to talk about in the next lecture, I think that has some difficulty because of exactly what you mentioned. How do I reconcile this with God's image and likeness? How do I reconcile that? How do I reconcile that with the fact that Jesus Christ came and took our body? Was like, doesn't this have a glory? Why not a chimpanzee, just like you said? So the biblical message is a little bit at tension with this, and we have to admit it. But in the same token, when we are going to look at whether scientists or biblical scholars or theologians, I'll give you a very simple example. How would somebody with the theological weight of somebody like Pope John Paul endorse evolution? How would he endorse evolution? He would endorse evolution exactly in the format that I told you that Francis Collins said. That man evolved from precursor ancestor, and then at time in the history of mankind, when man was intelligent enough and spiritually evolved enough, God initiated the relationship. How would you reconcile that? And he would come and tell you, I don't think the image and likeness of mankind is bodily, or it should not be confined to a bodily status. Hence, me and the chimp are very different. Okay, other questions? Okay, go ahead.
You might mention this a little later, but I wanted to ask about just other human subgroups, and you were speaking about how they could be there's an ancestry model or a potential model that they could have been extinct after a point. So I wanted to ask if the ancestry model is the model that we kind of buy into, is it possible on a theological level that God created these other subgroups and then at one point decided to breathe, the breath of life into them, and then we were created as we are right now?
So God breathed into them the breath of life or the knowledge of God, and we evolved from that? Is that your question?
Not evolved, so not evolved, but rather that the point where the story of Adam and Eve starts, where the breath of life comes in. Is it possible that we had all these all these other human subgroups prior to that, and then the breath of life came in, and then the story of the creation where with Adam and Eve comes.
So, if you don't mind, I will answer this question in the next lecture, because the next lecture we're actually going to go into the biblical account, and I will go a little bit in details of the different viewpoints of Adam and Eve. But your point is extremely controversial. And that's actually the whole debate between people on the wing of like more of the Catholic Church, some people in the Russian Orthodox Church, okay, some people in more the liberal side of the evangelical, and those are on the other side who kind of really look at the historicity of Adam and Eve as unquestionable. Okay, so I'll answer this in the next lecture. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so you were talking to him and saying that random doesn't necessarily mean unguided.
Yes.
Okay, so what do you see as like guided randomness? Because that to me is like doesn't make sense. Like
an oxymoronic, like
yeah, because like then it's like okay, so guided randomness. Randomness is necessarily going to entail like certain mutations that lead certain groups to become obsolete, right? Because they're not selected for. That's like God making a mistake. Guided randomness, and this particular random mutation is one that's faulty. So that to me, like I just don't think that that's like it's a hard argument to like.
And in this specific question, I think this is one of the toughest, not scientific questions only, but philosophical questions in the philosophy of science, and the big debate between somebody like theistic evolution and intelligent design. I think it comes back to the point of what is knowledge and what is omniscience. Okay, who knows what? To me, with my limited knowledge, it looks to me very random, and when I study it, it is very random because of my knowledge of the current affairs and the future affairs of life, including my life and other people's life, does not exist. Because I don't have that knowledge, I determine it as random, and it's truly random when I study it. However, if you look in my belief, who God is. God is omniscient. God is not governed by these laws of nature that confine me and confine my study. Okay? God is outside of that. That's at least my belief as a theist. Okay? Hence, I can see it compatible that God would allow a mechanism that has randomness involved in it, because that's part of biological nature. If it was not random and it was determined, that's called the fatalism or determinism, that everything is absolutely going to happen like this, I don't think this is the life we're living. But from God's perspective, outside of the laws of this nature, as well as being omniscient, He knows the outcome of this randomness. So the knowledge of the outcome of the randomness, okay, does not necessarily mean it cannot stay as random. Okay? Guided, in my sense, equals knowledge. Guided means knowing the outcome. Guided means knowing that He can predict what the outcome would look like. Hence, if I take it a step back, not even talking about you or me, but I talk about humanity, can an atheist scientist would say that the randomness of the evolutionary mechanism tells me that from day one that evolution started from the single cell, mankind was not in its mind. That's what an atheist scientist would say, because it's random. It just happened by mere chance. From God's perspective would say, I don't think so. It's like, as God outside of the confines of this natural law that governs us and being omniscient, the process could be random, and it is random. But the outcome of this randomness, okay, is predictable and known. Okay? And I think this is what the intelligent design people, somebody like Stephen Meyer, read his book, is an amazing book. Because what Stephen Meyer looks at the complexity of the information in the cell and in the DNA and in this biological world. And looks at this complexity of the information and sees a pattern of intelligence. Okay? And from that, he determines that there is an intelligent mind that is predicting and knows of this outcome, even though that the natural laws that dominate it are random. So I don't think this invalidates this. Where do I get this from? This is a philosophical answer. It's a theological answer, not a scientific answer. However, the opposite of it, that somebody would come and tell me, well, there's no intelligent mind, I think that's also a philosophical answer. So we're both on the same ground of knowledge.
Okay. My follow-up to that is that sounds like deism. So like, why wouldn't you just call it deism?
That's an excellent point, and that's what I like. I told you, is theistic evolution a form of deism? Okay? Is it a form of deism? That God started the process, created the factory, and let the factory then take over, and then he removed his hand. Francis Collins would answer and say no, because Francis Collins believes that there are two major interventions of God in the history of humanity. Number one, the introduction of the moral law. Number two, the introduction of the spirit and knowledge of God. And, go ahead and read his book, The Language of God, because he has a very good case in this. So he doesn't think that God is a deist because God would then remove his hand completely and it would not communicate with humanity. So in those two things, he does not think biologically can be explained. I know of the studies that talk about the biological background of morality. I think it's still very early, okay? But that is from his perspective, his answer against deism. Thanks for the question. Okay. Yes, go ahead. Yeah, just stand up.
So my question is also...
Oh, you've got a notepad.
I do, yeah. My question is also about the randomness. So for the third question, the third time asked, it's my question. My issue is with describing evolution as a random process. I think mutations are random, and we do get several bad mutations, as you showed, and several good mutations, like the FOX2 that you talked about, or several ones that can be lived through, like the vitamin C deficiency that you talked about. But the process that guides evolution, natural selection, which we didn't talk about at length, is not random. It's selective because it is natural selection. It's often directional, unidirectional or bidirectional. And one of the things you said was that the thing that guides the process needs to be outside of the process. And I'm struggling with that statement because I think the natural selection, which is inside this process of evolution, is the guiding force. And it's not random. I mean, Richard Dawkins himself would not tell you that it's random. I think this is a big part of evolutionary discourse, that it's not a random guidance. It is a directional selection through natural selection and artificial selection.
So my answer to this
a little better.
is two things. I think there is a biological answer and a philosophical answer. From a biological answer, first of all, if it's natural selection based on the evidence that we're seeing in this current world has failed to explain how diversity can evolve from an unrelated species or from a single cell, if it's just natural selection. Because natural selection, what is proven so far, is pure microevolution. And I think the example of the sickle cell anemia and the malaria is the biggest example of something that has been given enough time to evolve to combat something that is considered an enemy to it, and it couldn't change. So that's number one. Number two, I agree with you that the randomness, talking about the random mutation, okay? However, saying that, when you look at the philosophical background of scientists such as Richard Dawkins, they extrapolate from the random mutation to say that the process itself is random in one thing, that the outcome of the change does not have whether the benefit or the harm of what's being changed. So you get a FOXP2 mutation. You end up so lucky. Wow, I can speak, okay? You have a different mutation like the vitamin C. Oh man, if I'm a sailor in the middle of the sea, I'll die if I don't have vitamin C. So the outcome of the mutation does not have the benefit of the organism in mind. That is the randomness, okay? And the problem that I have is that how can you then take a mechanism as such, okay, and extrapolate all the information that you can explain all diversity based on this random mutation. Okay? That is my problem. And this is where the people of the intelligent design come, is like the complexity of what we're seeing is outside of the confines of a process as random mutation. Partly because of what we're seeing right now in this day and age. If you go by the uniformitarianism of the laws, it's hard to extrapolate that. There's a question in the back there.
I have a question. It's more so of a scientific question, just out of curiosity. But for the process of microevolution and natural selection, if you mentioned, for example, drug-resistant bacteria, they've gained the ability through mutation to be resistant to drugs, or certain cancer cells, which we knew at one point were not resistant to drugs, can now pump out the drugs from their cell. So are we totally averse to the idea that we're still in the process of change, meaning that small mutations, here and there will result in us no longer having oncogenic mutations or diabetes or things that are passed along that are unfavorable?
When you mean we're resistant to the change in terms of it naturally happening or actually scientifically modifying it?
Through whatever process it is, if it's a random change or if it's modified, or if it's just an unfavorable trait that I have that I won't pass on to my child, for example.
So I don't think anyone within the Christian camp is against microevolution because it's very well documented, whether it is in cancer or in antibiotic resistance and many different examples. Nobody's against that. However, if you're asking about the point of genetic modification to improve outcome and improve quality of life, I don't believe that there is a lot of resistance in the Christian camp. However, I would ask you to, let's wait until the fourth lecture tomorrow morning, because tomorrow morning I am actually going to touch base on this, the bioethical dilemma that stems from the evolutionary debate. And one of it is genetic enhancement. Okay, so we'll talk about it a little bit tomorrow. But in general, microevolution, I think even the most conservative Christians would agree on microevolution. Okay? Yeah, in the back there, and then we'll come to the front. Huh? Double K question. Okay, one and then one more in the front here because you really had. Sorry. Okay, go ahead. Yes. Which one? In the front here. In the front here, he had a question. No, here. Just no. Oh, that's okay. Okay, so go ahead. Go ahead in the back. Right there. Sorry. We'll give you a chance right after. Yes. Go ahead.
If evolution is true, doesn't that mean that there was suffering and death before men had a chance to sin and mess it all up?
Man, you're reading my mind because the next lecture is all about that. So yes, and that's why I was like, it's a really tough because I thought about whether to do the biblical one first or evolution first. I think suffering and death and how we interpret it from a theological and biblical standpoint is extremely tough based on what evolutionary model you take. That's going to be next lecture. I'm going to go into details of that. Okay? Since it was short, we can allow one more question here from our guest in the front.
I have two questions. One's related to microevolution. I've heard microevolution can just the distinction between micro and macroevolution is just a matter of time. Like macroevolution is just microevolution over a long period of time, so it's basically the same thing. So the distinction is kind of arbitrary. And the second question is kind of related to that too. It's like natural selection. I've heard I understand evolution is organisms will mutate randomly, and then environmental factors will come in, and then the ones that die won't be able to reproduce, so they won't be able to pass on the genes. So naturally but also it's a matter of reproduction, so there's also other factors like sexual selection, where
would make a difference eventually.
Yeah, and then also if random lightning or volcano just wipes something out of their control, that will even if they're their genes are superior, they get they're better
They'll
adapted.
extinct from that.
Yeah, but that could be guided by God. I mean.
So briefly, this is the last question. I'll answer the first one. So yes, the distinguishing factors between micro and macro sometimes get a bit shady. However, if you want to be very specific, the main distinction between micro and macro is would an organism cross species to form a new species that it would not mate with. That is the distinction. And in some sense, when they say that multiple microevolutions would lead to macro, I think it's very simplistic. Partly because when we view the current, just like the evidence I mentioned, we have not witnessed within our current modern technology any of that change. And that's why they came up with the point of the saltation. Could you find a jump in the genetic mutation that you take all of a sudden 3 to 4 genes at a single time to make that change? Okay? I find it this is where it's not a theory, this is actual hypothesis. You've even made a step back. That the hypothetical framework they are thinking about this macroevolution is by a moment where 3 to 4 genes would change in the same time to give an organism a chance to become a completely new species and from there move on. This is a hypothesis. I think it's a respected scientific hypothesis. It has not come up to the point of even facts that can support it to become even a theory. Okay? I think people make a lot of generalization, okay, where they take even a small thing, like for example, that point about a gene that has made a duplicate gene and has freed that gene to then modify and do a completely different species. That is a hypothesis. Okay? But you're absolutely right. The main difference between a macro and micro is, are you creating a new species that would not mate with its original parent? Okay? Thank you very much for your time.